Sometimes you just stop and wonder about things. Big things. Like, what if we could put everything we know, everything humanity has ever learned, into something super tiny? Like, could we store all human knowledge in a single gram? It sounds like something from a wild movie, right? But let's actually think about it for a bit. What would that even mean? What would it take? And is it even possible? It's a huge question, and it takes us down a rabbit hole of what knowledge actually is, how much of it there is, and how small we can make the things that hold it. It's not just about fitting all the letters and numbers into a tiny space, it's about so much more. First off, what are we even talking about when we say all human knowledge? That's a massive idea. Is it every book ever written? Every scientific paper, every piece of music, every movie, every photograph? What about the entire internet? All the web pages, all the videos on YouTube, all the posts on social media, all the emails ever sent. And what about the knowledge that isn't written down, like the skills a master craftsman has, or the intuition a doctor develops over years? That kind of knowledge, the tacit stuff, is really hard to put into a file. For this kind of storage problem, we mostly have to think about knowledge that can be turned into data, into ones and zeros. So let's just focus on the stuff we can digitize, the recorded knowledge. Like, even that is an unbelievably huge amount of information. Think about the Library of Congress, which holds millions of books, recordings, photos, maps, and more. If you tried to digitize just a fraction of that, you'd be looking at terabytes and petabytes of data. And that's just one library. Now, imagine every library in the world, every museum, every archive, every university's research papers. Add to that all the movies ever made, all the music ever recorded, every radio broadcast, every TV show. Then there's the internet. The internet isn't just websites, it's vast databases, scientific data from telescopes and particle accelerators, genetic sequences of countless species, climate models, financial transactions, and every single thing people share on their phones. We're talking about an amount of data that measures in zettabytes, which is a number so big it's hard to even picture. One zettabyte is a trillion gigabytes. Some estimates say the entire digital universe is already in the tens of zettabytes, and it's growing super fast. Every second, more knowledge, more data is created. So, all human knowledge isn't a fixed thing, it's a moving target, constantly expanding. It's like trying to catch smoke. So to store all human knowledge, we're talking about potentially hundreds of zettabytes, maybe even a yottabyte or more. A wattabyte is 1,000 zettabytes. That's a 1 with 24 zeros after it in bytes. That's an incomprehensible amount of data. Now, let's get to the single gram part. What does a gram of storage even mean? It means a physical piece of material that weighs 1 gram. How much data can you cram into something that tiny? Think about the storage we use every day. Your phone might have 256 gigabytes, or maybe even a terabyte. That's a lot for a phone, but it's still nowhere near a zettabyte. A typical hard drive in your computer might hold a few terabytes. If you bought a whole bunch of those drives, say 1,000 of them, you'd have a petabyte. You'd need a room full of hard drives to get to an exabyte. And to get to a zettabyte, you'd need an entire data center, a massive building filled with racks and racks of servers, all powered and cooled. We're talking about buildings the size of multiple football fields, and all of that just for 1 zettabyte. Remember, we need hundreds, maybe thousands, of zettabytes, so storing all that in a single gram using today's hard drive technology. That's just not going to happen, it's not even close. What about flash memory, like in your USB stick or SSD drive? That's denser than traditional spinning hard drives, but still, it's not magically going to get us into the zettabyte per gram territory. The electronics and the physical chips still take up space. They have limits. But scientists and engineers are always pushing the boundaries. There are ideas like holographic storage, which uses lasers to store data throughout the volume of a material, not just on its surface. It's much denser than regular drives, but still not enough for our all-human knowledge in a gram goal. This is where we have to start thinking outside the box, or rather outside the silicon chip. We need something fundamentally different, something that stores information at a much, much smaller scale. We need to go down to the molecular level, and that's where DNA storage comes into the picture. It sounds like science fiction, using the very stuff that makes us who we are to store our knowledge. But it's real science, and it's incredibly promising. Think about DNA. It's a molecule, a tiny, tiny strand that carries all the genetic instructions for building and operating a living thing. It does this with just 4 chemical bases, often called A, T, C, and G. These are like the alphabet of life. And just like we use zeros and ones binary code to store information in computers, scientists have figured out how to use these 4 DNA bases to store digital data. You can represent 0 with A, 1 with T, 10 with C and 11 with G, for example. The amazing thing about DNA is its density. It's incredibly small. A tiny speck of DNA holds a vast amount of information. Because it operates at the molecular scale, a single gram of DNA can theoretically store an unbelievable amount of data. Some very optimistic estimates suggest that 1 gram of DNA could hold up to 455 exabytes. Remember, an exabyte is a billion gigabytes, so 455 exabytes is a truly mind-boggling number. If we go with that 455 exabytes per gram figure, let's do the math again for all human knowledge. We said it could be around 100 zettabytes, which is 100,000 exabytes. If 1 gram holds 455 exabytes, then to store 100,000 exabytes, we would need 100,000 divided by 455. That comes out to roughly 220 grams. So even with the most optimistic theoretical limits of DNA storage as we understand it now, we're not talking about a single gram. We're talking about something like 220 grams. That's about half a pound, roughly the weight of a decent-sized apple. It's still incredibly compact, much, much smaller than any data center, but it's not 1 gram. This means if we want to hit that single gram target, we need to go even further. What would that even look like, further than DNA? We'd have to go beyond molecules, down to the atomic level. Imagine not just using the sequence of DNA bases, but literally arranging individual atoms to represent information. Scientists have actually done very basic experiments with this, moving individual atoms around on a surface to spell out words or create tiny images. If you could control every single atom in a gram of material and use its position or state to encode information, the storage density would be beyond anything we can truly grasp. It would be astronomical. At that scale, a gram would certainly hold far more than all human knowledge. But here's the thing, while it's theoretically possible to arrange atoms, the challenges are enormous. How do you write that data? How do you read it back without disturbing the atoms? How do you keep it stable for any length of time? And how do you do it quickly enough to write gigabytes, let alone zettabytes, of information? The energy needed, the precision required, the heat generated, these are all huge hurdles that make atomic storage, at least for now, a dream far in the future. And then there's the absolute theoretical limit of information storage, defined by the laws of physics. It's called the Bekenstein bound. This is where things get truly mind-bending. It basically says there's a maximum amount of information that can be stored in a given region of space that has a certain amount of energy. It tells us that a black hole, the densest object in the universe, is the ultimate information storage device for its size. If you were to turn a gram of matter into a tiny black hole, its surface could theoretically store an unfathomable amount of information, vastly more than all human knowledge. But, of course, you can't exactly retrieve information from a black hole, so while it's the theoretical limit, it's not a practical solution for storing our books and videos. So, coming back to our practical question, could we store all human knowledge in a single gram? With today's technology, absolutely not. With DNA storage pushed to its theoretical limits, maybe not quite a single gram, but perhaps a few hundred grams. And if we're talking about pushing physics to its absolute wildest theoretical limits, like atomic level storage or beyond, then yes, the pure bit density might be there. But storing bits is only part of the story. There's a whole lot more to it than just fitting the ones and zeros. Even if we could compress all those zettabytes into a gram of something, how would we ever access it? Imagine you have a tiny speck, and somewhere within that speck is the answer to a question you have, or a memory of a lost song. How do you find it? How do you pull out just that one piece of information from billions and billions of other pieces? We'd need unbelievably advanced indexing systems, search algorithms, and retrieval mechanisms, all of which would likely exist outside of the gram itself. The gram would just be the raw data, the library without a catalog, without librarians, without a building to contain it all. It would be like having all the books in the world shrunk down and pressed into a single, unorganized lump. You'd have the data, but no knowledge. And what about the act of writing? To store all that knowledge, we first need to write it onto this tiny medium. For DNA storage, this process is incredibly slow and expensive right now. To synthesize strands of DNA that encode all human knowledge would take an immense amount of time, energy, and resources. We're talking centuries, maybe millennia, and costs that are mind-boggling. The technology to write DNA needs to improve by orders of magnitude in speed, cost, and accuracy. Then there's the reading process. Reading DNA is also slow and expensive. You have to sequence the DNA, which means figuring out the order of all those A's, T's, C's, and G's. And to read it fast enough to access data on demand, that's another monumental challenge. What if you want to stream a movie from this gram? It's just not practical right now. And what about errors? When you write data to DNA or when you read it, there are always errors. DNA synthesis and sequencing aren't perfect. For computers, we have error correction codes that add extra information to detect and fix mistakes. We'd need incredibly robust error correction for DNA storage because a single error could corrupt massive amounts of data in such a dense medium. And there's durability and longevity. DNA is pretty good at lasting a long time. We find ancient DNA in fossils that are tens of thousands of years old, but that's usually in specific, protected conditions. Over thousands of years, even DNA degrades. What if this gram is exposed to heat, radiation, or just the slow march of entropy? If all our knowledge is in one tiny spot, and that spot gets damaged, it could be catastrophic. We're talking about the complete loss of our collective history and understanding. This leads to the need for backups, of course. You can't put all your eggs in one gram. You need to replicate this gram many times and store those copies in safe places all over the world, or even in space. But then, it's not just a single gram anymore, is it? Another big question is the format. Even if we could store all the bits, like what format are they in? Will future civilizations thousands of years from now even know how to read our modern file format? Will they understand JPEGs, MP4s, PDFs, or the specific encoding we use for DNA? We need some kind of Rosetta Stone for the data itself, a way to explain how to interpret the zeros and ones. Otherwise, it would just be meaningless noise. And we need to consider the energy. Writing and reading all that information, even if it's super dense, requires energy. A lot of it, the process for DNA synthesis and sequencing, are energy intensive. Scaling that up to store the entire sum of human knowledge would demand an incredible energy footprint, at least with current methods. Then there's the philosophical side of things. Is storing all the data truly storing all human knowledge? Knowledge isn't just raw data, it's context, it's understanding, it's the ability to interpret, to connect ideas, to form new thoughts. A gram of data, no matter how dense, is just that data. It doesn't inherently contain wisdom, insight, or the ability to reason. Those things live in our minds, in our cultures, in our interactions. Imagine a future where all the information is packed into a tiny speck. What kind of world would that be? Would we stop learning new things if everything was already known and stored? Would it change how we think about access to information? Who would control this gram of knowledge? Would it be open to everyone or locked away by a select few? The power dynamics of such a thing would be immense. And remember, knowledge is always growing. The moment you finish storing all human knowledge in that gram, new knowledge would be created. New discoveries, new art, new experiences. That gram would be instantly out of date. It would be a snapshot, but life keeps moving, keeps creating. So to keep it truly all human knowledge, you'd need a continuous, never-ending process of updating and writing to this tiny, impossibly dense storage device. So, to wrap it up, can we store all human knowledge in a single gram? In a purely theoretical sense, if you push the absolute limits of physics and imagine technologies far beyond what we have today, then yes, the sheer bit capacity of a single gram of matter could be vast enough. If we're talking about arranging individual atoms, or even pushing into the quantum realm, the numbers become mind-bogglingly large. But in any practical sense, with current or even near future technology, the answer is no, not a single gram. Even DNA storage, while incredibly dense, doesn't quite get us there for the full, expansive, ever-growing definition of all human knowledge. It might get us to a few hundred grams, which is still amazing, but not the single gram. And even if we did manage to pack all the bits into that tiny speck, the journey is far from over. We'd face immense challenges with writing, reading, preserving, and accessing that information. We'd have to figure out how to give meaning to the data, how to turn raw information into actual knowledge and understanding for future generations. It's not just a storage problem, it's a problem of legacy, access, and the very definition of what it means to know something. So the idea of a single gram holding everything we know is a wonderful thought experiment. It pushes us to think about the limits of technology, the vastness of information, and the preciousness of human understanding. It reminds us that knowledge is more than just bits and bytes. It's a living, breathing, ever-evolving thing that exists in our minds and in the world around us. And that's something far too complex to ever fully confine to a speck of matter, no matter how clever we get.